Welcome to the Fleet Geeks podcast. We're here to help develop fleet and transport professionals. Do you want to progress and develop your skills and knowledge? We promise to bring lively conversation and debate around interesting issues and keep you bang up to date with changes in our awesome industry. The Fleet Geeks are a community of professionals, and if you enjoy the podcast, why not join the discussion for free in the Fleet Geek community over on Facebook?
I am super pleased to be joined by James, Tom and Mike. If you haven't heard them already, please listen to the previous episode. I'm not going to go around introductions for a second time because people will get tired of that. But if you listen to the previous podcast, you will hear all about Tom Reddy, James Adcroft and Mike Vickers. And today they're joining me and we're going to be talking about what the Transport Manager CPC, well, I called it the Transport Manager CPC. That's not really what it's called, is it? The Road Haulage CPC course type, whatever the official, official
just
course.
Make it up,
everyone
please.
knows it. Yeah, everyone knows it as a Transport Manager CPC course, right? Anyway, what that course doesn't teach you, which is basically how to do the job in a nutshell. But I'm going to sort of come to you guys. There we go. Certificate of Professional Competence in Road Haulage. Tom has kindly turned around his certificate so that I can see it, which is fantastic. So, go on then, hands up first. Who wants to go first? Transport Manager CPC, what's not being taught?
Well, I guess...
Go for it, Mike, go on.
I should know what's not being taught, pretty much, shouldn't I? But yeah, what's not being taught? I reflected on this in the recent transport briefing that we held here at Flagship HQ a couple of weeks ago. I reflected on it in my presentation, and I'm going to start off with a couple of high-level items, and I'm sure the guys will be able to fill in with some of the other stuff as well that's more sort of pertinent on a day-to-day basis. But sort of from the high level, one of the things that gets me is we never talk about leasing, vehicle leasing, and that's a minefield for anybody in exam world. And I do talk to students about exam world, as I'm sure Tom does as well. Exam world and real world are two different places. And in exam world, we don't talk about vehicle leasing. But you imagine the scenario where you're a transport manager and you get released into the wild with your fresh certificate. And the first thing the managing director says to you is, look, we're looking at replacing the vehicles next year. We're looking at getting a new fleet of 10 vehicles or whatever. Can you sort the leases out for me? And you're sat there thinking, I can't remember Mike or Tom talking about leases during the course. What do we do? So leases for me would be a big thing. The other big high price ticket item that I don't think is talked about enough, I mean, we do mention it when we talk about vehicle costings to a degree, but is fuel. Suddenly you're landed as a transport manager, and your next role, your next job, or next on your to-do list, because there's lots of hungry lorries out there waiting to be filled up, is to source the fuel. How are you going to buy it? Do you bunker fuel? Have you got a deal with a local supplier? Do you buy it on Platts Plus, on all the other various schemes that you can buy it on cards? Just how do you do it? And if you've got to field 90,000, 100,000 litres a week of fuel from somewhere, just how do you do it? So for me, they're two big ticket items. That would certainly come across as being things that we don't really particularly cover in Transport Manager.
Fantastic, appreciate that, Mike. Thank you. Tom, what's your initial thoughts, mate?
I'm going to focus around technical knowledge, and that's probably an obvious one for me, but the lack of technical knowledge that the exam equips you with, although it's a very detailed exam, a lot of the stuff that they cover is not useful to you in the normal run of things running the operation. So the starting point is, if DVSA show up here tomorrow, what are they going to want to see? And we don't really know that. I mean, we do know it, but only if you've been under their regulatory action previously. So we're talking things like the desk-based assessment, what's on that, their maintenance investigation, what that involves, preparing for a public inquiry, all these things, what that would involve. So there's a massive shortfall there. It's a great starting point for any transport manager to try and get hold of that document if you can. And there are training courses you can go on that talk specifically about this stuff. To know what the starting point is, because you walk into a brand new operator tomorrow and you're kind of a rabbit in the headlights moment, aren't you? You don't really know what the next stages are. And it's only now, all these years later, that I feel confident enough in myself to sort of be able to just look around and assess everything almost on the hop to know exactly what the problems are and where to start. But for a new transport manager, that is going to be really challenging.
Fantastic, appreciate that, mate. Thank you. Obviously, you guys are Transport Manager CPC trainers. James, you employ people who have done Transport Manager CPC as an example. What sort of things would you be looking out for as a gap potentially to help bridge people who have come out of the TMCPC qualification?
What a great topic, Pete. I think we could fill between us a couple of hours on this. And if I may, up front, I'd like us to talk about a really interesting question off the back of it at some point or later about, so what do we think it should look like? Because I think that's just as important. But anyway, in answer to your question, thanks for asking. I mean, it's just that for me, it's just that day job stuff. A transport manager landing in a transport department on week 1 after completing their qualification, by the end of that week will need to be looking at tachograph reports and infringement letters and brake test reports and inspection reports, walk around checks, defects. That, you know, the literally the core bread and butter of what we do. Mike came up with some real great higher level stuff in terms of leasing and fuel and stuff. Really, like you say, really important big ticket items. But the transport manager, I don't think, is properly equipped coming out of their qualification to pick up a brake test report and read it. And we know that is vital. It's an absolute requirement from the moment they arrive. So I think it's just wide-ranging is the amount of things that a transport manager needs to know. And it can't be picked up quickly. I think a transport manager coming out of their qualification should really resign themselves to the fact that you're going to take 6 months, and that's a personal view, to really get a grips with some of those day-to-day things. You know, you're not going to see a compensation for weekly rest infringement for a few weeks and all of those sort of things, you know. So I think it's important for a transport manager to pace themselves, resign themselves to the fact that everything they see, they're probably going to have to ask a question about it in the first few months. And then maybe after 6 months, they start to build some competencies in terms of those day-to-day routines. Routines, what a great way to describe it. We don't teach routines in the TMCPC. You know, what do I need to do each week? What do I need to do each month? Maintenance planner, great example of a routine which is vital but doesn't drop out the bottom of CPC transport manager qualification. So lots of things there.
Yeah, appreciate that, James. Thank you. I think it's interesting actually how we all approach it from a different point of view based on our roles and our thought processes. Mike, obviously, I imagine have been landed at some point as a transport manager at having to sort lease and buy fuel and those kinds of things that hasn't been trained before. Similarly, you know, we talked about insurance and sourcing insurance, making sure we've got the right sort of insurance. And the different types of insurance, a lot of people don't really understand what that is. Is that part of the qualification, understanding the difference between employer's liability and public liability, goods in transit?
It's covered in the course. I mean, we do talk about insurance, but again, a very, very top level, very high level kind of discussions on it. But yeah, coming to buy insurance and coming to deal with things like brokers, etc., and making sure you get the best deal, not just the best deal, but the best service, and who do you know to trust to speak to in the industry. I mean, that sort of thing, you know, is not covered in the course. But yeah, that's an interesting point James raises with what could we do to improve it, and so I guess it brings me on to my thoughts on. We talked about we've had a podcast previously where we talked about the changes that are inbound for, or potentially inbound for, driver CPC. And listeners may be aware that if you take a Transport Manager CPC today, you'll be taking the international version. So that it's been around since 2011. You've had to take the international version of Transport, but there's no option now just to take a national version. And I don't know what the guests think about the notion of perhaps going back to a national CPC for transport managers, but widening the syllabus to cover a few more of these things. I don't know what you guys think.
That's an interesting point, Mike. We could look at that, couldn't we? Because it would free up a lot of. The question I always ask the students on the first day is, mentioning briefly international, what it involves, what it doesn't involve, how we can't really teach it in a coherent way. And then you ask for a show of hands. Who here is going to do international work after this? And at the moment, post-Brexit world, the answer is usually no.
Zero.
Unless the company is doing it already. So it's very hard you get the problem of you could have a 4-week course, you could have a 6-week course full time teaching everything possible that a transport manager can know, but no one's going to want to attend it, no one's going to be able to afford it, and so there's this sweet spot you have to come to somewhere in the middle, isn't it? But going back to the national, international, especially in a post-Brexit world, it's a very different landscape now than it was in 2011 when they came up with that decision.
Yeah, I think I'd like to add that. So when I look at it from my perspective, I think that's absolutely balmy that we pay for a qualification, that we pay people often to attend a qualification and to spend that time learning something, which, largely speaking, a large proportion of that time spent learning, they are learning stuff that is not relevant to their business. And that actually their time would be better spent learning more relevant things. That is almost something that, as I sort of navel gaze and think, do you know what? The world's gone balmy. Why are we doing that? So I'm going to go straight back at you, Tom. I know that you've created the Transport Manager Unlocked program. Now that is pretty much targeting this shortfall in capacity of the Transport Manager CPC. So are you able to just highlight some of the stuff that's covered as part of that?
Yes. I mean, we based that programme of training around, basically, if the DVSA were to show up tomorrow, what would they ask for? So as part of it, we go through what they call now the desk-based assessment, which gives the DVSA a structure to look at your operation. Most people don't have that structure. They don't know what it is for a start, but also they don't have a lot of it in place. Some things they ask you for are not documented. Things like safety recalls, AdBlue consumption rates, not well explained or understood. So we focus on very much the practical, and we don't repeat any of the theory. So we don't go back over driver's hours. The assumption is you know what the rules are, but we talk about different ways of managing different software. We go through a range of different software, demonstrate how it works. That's a massive gap for most transport managers, and those we try and focus in as much as we can in the 3 days on the actual practical side of it. We also look at a vehicle up front in the flesh, so to speak. So you can put your hands on it. We can talk about what do you make of this, what kind of operation would you find these vehicles in, and what would you do to manage them. So hoping to fill some of those gaps, but it's not easy because at the same time you have to sell a course for your business. So there's a limit to what people want to pay and to what they want to sit down and cover.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Tom. Mike, I'm going to put you absolutely on the spot here, mate. But I'm going to say, if you could take stuff out of the Transport Manager CPC and put stuff in, what would you take out of the 2 weeks and what would you be putting in?
Oh, well, on the spot. No, it's something with Tom pretty much. What Tom alluded to there, it's some of the stuff we do on a day-to-day basis in dealing with the DVSA desk-based. It's not easy to say, is it? I've been trying to say this for the last couple of days actually, because I've been doing one. It's not easy to say.
Half-baked assessment.
Yeah, half-baked assessment. That's probably about right, isn't it? But dealing with that and looking at the brake testing and kind of stuff like that. So what would I take? Let's start with what would I take out first.
Hello, it's Shani from Flagship Partners. We are really proud to sponsor the Fleet Geeks podcast. If you need expert advice or training for your fleet business, make Flagship Partners your first choice. We are really excited to announce the launch of our Transport Manager Academy. With expert development for fleet leaders, we offer fully accredited initial Transport Manager CPC training, CPC refresher, and operator license awareness training, as well as mentoring, support, and professional development beyond the qualification. Our vision is to develop elite fleet professionals.
Yeah, I would definitely think the international side of it. I mean, I kind of look at people, and no disrespect to people, I'm of an age where I sort of remember going through customs years ago before we had free market. So I'm aware, I've always been aware from a reasonably early age what duty is, what duty, import duty and export duty, what it means, what it is. But there are people now who just have no idea what duty is. And so you spend half a lesson explaining to people why we have duty. And then you can then go on to explain, go into the rest of the syllabus in terms of the international movement of goods. But yeah, you're wasting so much time. That time could be spent concentrating on the stuff that's really, really important to everyday work. So I think certainly going back to a national exam and including in that some more relevant stuff. Maybe, I keep going. Anybody who listens to these podcasts regularly will know that I talk about pigs and watering pigs regularly. Now, I think if you were into, then that's not to say that we don't sometimes have people who transport animals on our courses. Dangerous goods, for example. Yes, definitely. We have people on the courses that do that, but they are quite often specialists in that already because it's what they do. So I would take out those niche things like dangerous goods, waste, animal transportation. Not that they're not important, because they are, and they're a part of our industry. But people who are into that would be specialists into that. So I would take all of those out. I'm not quite sure whether I would want really to take out health and safety, although the health and safety is a major part of it, and HR, because I think they are the skills that we do need as well. But so certainly for me it would be those kind of niche areas.
It's been a few years, Mike. Remind me, what is covered in the health and safety and HR part of the qualification?
Well, it's pretty much. I believe that HR is too focused. In terms of, but as a frontline manager, you will be responsible for dealing with things like disciplinary and grievance procedures. I'm not quite so sure if we spend too much time and effort on things like redundancy payments, because that might not be in the gift of the transport manager to have any influence over. Redundancy payments, even things like sick pay. Most of us would just reach for HR advice on that type of thing, but it does go into that in quite a bit of detail. Health and safety, yes, of course, we know that the transport workplace is a very unsafe place and can be very dangerous, so we do need to cover it off, but we do go into it in a little bit of too much detail. We certainly talk about a riddle, which would probably fit in. People do have accidents in the yard and fall off tail lifts, etc. But one area we go into with health and safety, I don't think that it's worth spending any time on display screen equipment. I mean, when do we use display screen equipment in our world? Yes, it's a part of health and safety and etc. Lola's quite important, and provision and use of workplace equipment, that type of thing, I guess. But yeah, it does go into it in quite depth.
I'll tell you what, I want to bang my head on the table. People talking about DSE equipment in the Transport Manager CPC, yet no mention of bridge strikes.
Yeah, and I tell you, the other thing, no mention of driver's eyesight as well, because we're looking through a screen all day, aren't we? As drivers, we're looking through a big screen all day, but we don't talk about eyesight checking.
Absolutely baffling. Tom, over to you, mate. What would you take out and put in, mate?
It's tricky, isn't it? Because look, I'm just thinking through the topics. We know them like the back of a hand, of the module numbers and things. Things like company law are very hard for people to take in.
Definitely. And
talking about legal topics, I know it's a close to your heart thing, Mike, isn't it? But you could argue how much of the legal side do they need to understand. You'd have to know the basics to apply for an operator license, but beyond that, also the financial management elements. Different exam boards have wound back on that a little bit when we're talking about balance sheets and trading accounts and things. But it's most transport managers will never revisit that stuff unless they start and run their own company, which is what it's preparing you for. I take that on board. It's very hard because you spend 6-7 days covering the syllabus, and then it turns into the exam factory for the last few days where you're trying to teach them how to get through the exam, because that's what it's about. Yeah. We don't have any room to cover the practical. You walk into an operator with a red OCRS, what do you do? Now, some exam boards have, again, moved a bit more towards practical type assessment questions, asking those things, but it's very hard to get that across and all the syllabus content at the same time. So it's tricky, very hard to know.
Appreciate that, Tom. James, over to you. What would you like to see taken out and put in that would be important to you in your role?
I don't think, in terms of taking out, I can add much to the two Transport Manager CPC trainers beside me. I agree with some of the stuff they said. I was mindful when Mike was talking about taking things out of of perhaps some modular elements. And again, this is just off the top of my head. When Mike was describing some of the health and safety stuff, and Tom talked about some of the corporate law stuff and finance, I wonder if there's a core training course which could be focused upon our bread and butter, as I described it for, that real transport stuff, and then maybe some of the other stuff like health and safety, and we've talked about people and corporate finance, whatever. I wonder if they could be modular. Well, you can do those separately. But I guess in terms of putting in, and like I say, I really can't add much more than we talked about earlier, and these guys have said. I think something practical feels right, doesn't it? We live in that world now. Academia, I would say, is being challenged in our world today, and you see this in apprenticeship schemes. The mechanism by which we are seeing our school leavers educated and brought into the workplace now is less academic. We're starting to see less emphasis on university and the academic path, and more on apprenticeships and a practical approach to vocational training. It feels like that's where we need to go. I would say, why not have either some practical modules, so part of it is spent in, whether it be a notional or fictional transport office, or maybe you go and visit one. I don't know how that looks, but let's start looking at some of those maintenance elements and some of those day job elements practically. And you could say the same from an examination perspective. Should it be an examination, or should it be continually assessed by trainers like Mike and Tom? There would be my thoughts, Pete.
Fabulous idea there, James. Assessed. And I'm sure, Tom, I know we both do this. We probably don't admit to it, but, I'm always tempted to sit and just before the exam thinking, they'll pass, or that particular person's going to struggle, or there. And sometimes I think this person's not going to pass, but deep down I know that actually they'd make a very good transport manager. It's just like we can't get them over the line academically. And it's such a shame, because if we could introduce an element of maybe some tutor assessment or an interview, maybe a panel of people, maybe a panel, august panel such as ourselves interviewing somebody, would soon find out whether they were going to make a transport manager or not. I don't know what sorry, James, you come back on.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and I'll tell you another thing that I would really be welcome. I would really welcome, and I'd like to see in terms of continual assessment, and that was, I would welcome the trainer coming and visiting the transport manager at their operation. So again, we're talking about what could it look like. Yeah. I'd be quite happy for the transport manager to complete part of their kind of classroom-based or some degree of practical training. But then why not have a period of a couple of months where they're in the operation, but in order to get their qualification signed off, the trainer has to come and spend an hour a fortnight looking at what they're doing. So then we are pushing ourselves, we're forcing ourselves to get the trainer to step away from that theoretical classroom stuff and actually sit down and say, well, show me your maintenance planner. Let's have a look at your drivers. Let's have a look at your tachograph analysis system, whatever. I would, if I was looking after an operation, I would love to see a trainer come in with a new transport manager working through that 6 months of learning curve that I described earlier, and have them there to help and as well as get them signed off.
I think that it's not actually occurred to me in that way before, but like you're talking an MVQ type level thing where you almost have a task book to complete, and so you get spend half a day with the tyre fitter, see what they do, put your hands on the torque wrench, those sorts of things. And then the tachograph analysis, you could build in an afternoon a full program of work around that, and then sign it off as complete, and then that's when you get your certificate. So you've actually got some. There would be all sorts of checks and balances need to be in place, but coming back briefly to academia, in this modern world where we have to acknowledge things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, people who can't do maths, can't write very well, they're not well served by this qualification, because they don't get a year or 6 months of support in the classroom. They get 2 weeks, and if you can't keep up with the pace, so to speak, and the trainer has limited ability to dedicate to that one person, they kind of get left by the wayside. And you do see these people that, sadly, you know on that last day of the course that they're probably not going to get across the line in the exam, and you feel powerless. It's really quite hard. But also, depending on your education system, something that came up to me recently was Eastern Europeans. In Eastern Europe, a decimal place is a comma, and a comma is a decimal place, and I didn't know that until I started teaching the Transport Manager CPC. But again, the expectation is you just have to suddenly figure out what we're teaching you. So a more vocational-based program would just serve those people so much better, and they'd probably end up better transport managers in the end.
I think that's some bombshell we're dropping there, but I think if the powers that be were interested in actually re-reviewing the CPC, we've got 4 people who would be quite happy to put their input into that consultation process. But ultimately, I think my argument would be is that it is a certificate of professional competence, and actually we're not measuring competence.
No.
As a transport manager, based on the conversation we're having, my argument and the bombshell, I guess if I was going to do my Jeremy Clarkson moment on that bombshell, the CPC is not measuring competence. And actually what we're talking about here is potentially a more work-based programme which involves assessment in the workplace. I think would be an absolutely fantastic route to go, and potentially making it more modular, like you say, so that international would be a module that you did. Animal transport would be a module that you did. Business management of a transport operation would be a module that you did as part of the overall qualification. And actually the qualification is focused on OCRS, driver infringements, tacho analysis, managing gate checks, managing maintenance, managing a planner, all of that proactive stuff, being able to respond to a DVSA audit, how to communicate effectively with the DVSA, all of that is actually what the qualification would look like. That is some bombshell.
So DFT, if you're listening, we are available and we're here. And absolutely. I think, it is time that we did look at this qualification, definitely. And as we're looking at driver CPC at the moment, what better time than to do it than now? And as you say, Tom, post-Brexit, it is a different world. Whether you wanted it or not wanted it, whatever side of the political persuasion you were on, it doesn't matter. We've got it. It's here to stay now. So, we better sort of get used to it, as it were.
And I think just sort of round it off, as like Tom said about being an inclusive an inclusive industry. Actually, we're being very exclusive in the way that we are testing the transport manager qualification, and actually, like Mike and Tom have both said, as clearly both very experienced transport manager CPC trainers, we've got potentially very good transport managers who are unable to pass the qualification due to academic challenges. And likewise, what will also be happening is people that potentially don't have the competence but are passing the qualification because they're able to from an academic point of view, which kind of goes to show that it's not essentially fit for purpose. It's interesting, we started out the podcast recording a podcast about what is the shortfall, what is the CPC not teaching us, and we've ended up with a podcast on what should the CPC look like. James, over to you.
But I think that's important. So my personal perspective is that if we are going to discuss something that isn't quite right, it's absolutely incumbent on us to say, well, what is the right thing to do? It's easy to throw out a problem. I think that we've got ideas about what the solution is absolutely right. And I think that's important for anyone.
Yeah, and actually what you've just witnessed is a live curation of our own, as a group, we've kind of done the brainstorming session there live on the podcast. So what an amazing experience. So appreciate your input, gentlemen. Thank you very much. And hopefully you've got some value from that as the listener, and we'll see you all on the next one. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please share with your friends and colleagues too. Join us for free on Facebook with the Fleet Geeks community for transport and fleet managers. Fleet Geeks offers ongoing professional development, networking and mentoring too. So get in touch with me, Pete Rushmer, on any social media platform to find out more.